Hello and welcome to part 1 of my bolt action series, Monty's Ironsides, in which I'll be tracking my progress of building a British bolt action force from scratch all the way up through to 1,000 points and maybe even beyond. Now if you watch my previous video, you'll know that this video is about army building. It's going to be aimed more at beginners, people who aren't quite sure as to how a bolt action force is composed and how you get started with it. Now this video is going to be composed of 3 main parts. It's going to be first of all looking at the Reinforced Platoon, what that is and how you can build your force around it. Also some kind of starter tips for people who are just starting out with bolt action and want to know which direction to take their forces in initially. And finally I'm going to be talking about how I'm going to be building up my first 500 points of British Army for bolt action. So let's get started first of all by taking a look at the Reinforced Platoon. So if you're new to bolt action, you might not know what a reinforced platoon was. Essentially the bare bones skeleton that you'll be working from when building your bolt action force. Now if you've got access to one of your bolt action army books, I've got the Great Britain one here, or if you've got the main bolt action rulebook, you'll find a reinforced platoon in there. And on this particular page you'll find on 16 for the British Army one, and you'll see that we've got this, this kind of list at the bottom here. Now this list contains a number and also a unit reference. So for example you've got 0 to 1 captain or medic, 0 to 1 forward observer, 0 to 1 machine gun team, things like that. But you'll notice first of all that it's split into 2 sections. Now the top section is your mandatory units you must always take when fielding a reinforced platoon. Now that is either a first or a second lieutenant, followed by 2 infantry sections. Now when it refers to infantry sections, it literally means any infantry unit in your squad, available for your particular army. So for example, with the armies of the Great Britain forces, you could field early war, mid to late war units, or you could field inexperienced, regular or veteran units, or even 5-man squads or 10-man squads. As long as you fit, there's 2 squads in there and also a first and second lieutenant, that will fill your mandatory requirement for fielding a reinforced platoon. Then if you actually go down further on the list, you can actually field different specialised units. Now these do have numbers next to them. This is because you do have a maximum amount you can take. For example, you can take 3 additional infantry sections, which means you can take 5 infantry sections per platoon. You can have 0 to 1 captain or major, 0 to 1 medic, 0 to 1 forward observer, either artillery or air. You can also take 0 to 1 machine gun team, 0 to 1 mortar team, sniper team is 0 to 1 as well. 0 to 1 flamethrower, anti-tank, field artillery, armoured car, tank destroyer, transport vehicle. Now transport vehicles are slightly different. You can take 0 to 1 of those per infantry squad that you take. And this is because they act as like obviously a transport for that particular unit. However, but everything else pretty much apart from infantry sections is 0 to 1. So you could take 1 tank, 1 anti-tank team, 1 artillery team, things like that. It basically keeps you from someone just fielding a whole army of tanks, which you could do feasibly by fielding multiple reinforced platoons, but then it just keeps the amount that you can actually field down to a minimum. Now it's quite straightforward, and that's the basic reinforced platoon. Now if you have access to any of the theatre books, you'll notice that it sometimes refers to particular theatre selectors, and in the British Army you can see that here we've got this section, and this is because certain theatre selections are geared around particular points in the war or particular theatres. So for example, first of all we have Blitzkrieg 1939 to 1942. And this essentially means that the infantry sections available to the British are the early war equivalents, not the late war versions, which means that the loadouts of the units are slightly different. You've also got vehicles. You can only take some of the lighter tanks. You can't take some of the heavier tanks that are available later on in the war, for example. But these are all pretty much follow the same kind of pattern as before. There's a requirement of a first lieutenant or a second lieutenant, followed by 2 infantry sections, and then there's a limit on how many units you can take past that point. So hopefully that's given you a better idea as to how a reinforced platoon works. It's quite straightforward once you get your head around it, and as long as you follow that going forward, then you should have no trouble in building your force up. Which leads us to my next section, which is building your force for a beginner. So you've come to build your bolt action force, and the first thing you want to do is take out those clippers, your hobby knife, your plastic glue, and get to assembling your miniatures. But generally speaking, it's probably a good idea if you just take a step back for a moment, think about exactly what force you want to build and go from there. Be it just writing up a quick 500 point or 1,000 point army list, it's good to know exactly which troops you want in your force before you assemble them. There's nothing worse than coming down the line halfway and you're thinking, I've actually assembled too many special weapons or not enough sergeants or anything like that. It's just a good idea to know exactly what you're building towards. I always find it's quite good if you know you've got like a final target when you're actually keeping motivated in actually building up your force. Now the second point that I want to make in bolt action is to decide on early or late war. Now this is, I'm being quite flexible with the terms of early and late war, mainly because if you're building a force and you're going against opponents which are using late war forces, such as a Tiger II, then you don't want to be using your British expeditionary force that's only got access to a Vickers light tanks. You're going to find yourself struggling quite a bit in that regard. So have a rough idea. I mean, if you just bring in, for example, your army books, Great Britain one here, and you go to your theatre selectors that I've already mentioned in the last section, this will tell you roughly exactly which tanks are available at certain theatres or at certain points in the war. So these are invaluable resources in that regard. Now the third and final point I want to make is never underestimate the power of infantry in bolt action. Bolt action is at its core an infantry game, and this is represented in the fact that infantry are responsible for capturing and holding objectives. If you look at the scenarios, a lot of them require holding objectives of some sort, and you need to make sure you have plenty of infantry on the table throughout the game in order to capture those objectives. Now it can be quite tempting just to go for small 5-man squads and then spend all the money on a really expensive tank, but at the end of the day that tank is going to might do a lot of damage, but it's not going to be holding the objectives at the end of the game, which could cost you victory in that regard. So that's my 3 tips for bolt action. There are quite a few more different things that you can probably find by looking around forums, for example, but those are my 3 kind of main key areas that I would suggest when starting bolt action. Now let's move on to the final section, which I'll be discussing my initial 500 point list for my bolt action force that I'll be building as part of this video series. Now, as I mentioned in the previous section, it's always good practice to have an idea as to where you want to go with your bolt action force before you start assembling it. And this is exactly what I've done here. I've created a 500 point British bolt action list to kind of get me started. Now before I go on, I just want to mention that the list that I've gone for is a late war British list based around the 3rd Infantry Division on Normandy. So that's kind of the theme I'm going for there. Now the first element of my list is the 1st Lieutenant, who's armed with a rifle, and he's assisted by 2 other infantry who are also carrying rifles. Now this is because of Britain's national characteristic. They get to choose from a whole different range of special rules, and I've gone for rapid fire, which essentially gives you an extra shot for every 3 rifles that you fire in your squad. So rather than just having 3 rifles, I have 4 rifles, which is an excellent way of kind of building up your fire base, just even with your HQ, making them a little bit more useful rather than just being there to boost morale. Now the next section that I've gone for is obviously the mandatory infantry squad. So I've got 2 of these, both of them are identical, and they consist of 10 men with an NCO who's equipped with an SMG. Now I've gone for just the SMG on the NCO, as this will give me a little bit of more close range firepower. It does kind of sacrifice one of the shots at long range, but hopefully if these guys are capturing objectives, they're going to be a little bit closer to the enemy. Now I've purposely left out an LMG because this gives me 9 infantry to which to make the most of rapid fire from, and also find that the LMGs are a little bit overpriced for their effectiveness. Giving you a few extra shots for 20 points just seems quite expensive in my opinion. Now from there I've decided to go for a little bit more of an elite edge to my force. I've included 5 veterans and I've given them 3 SMGs. Now this is because I'm intending for them to get a little bit up close to the enemy, get into maybe even some close combat actions. But they'll be supported by their Bren transport troop, which will hopefully be getting them to the further objectives or used for outflanking enemies, for example. And there we have it, my 500 point British force. Now I think the force is fairly rounded out. It gives me plenty of options. I've not relied too much on any particular element of my force, and hopefully it gives me some flexibility in the battlefield. Now it's also quite nice, it's quite small, gives me about 30 miniatures to assemble and paint in order to get that unit field, and then I can actually start playing games straight away. So now that we've looked at the 3 sections, let's move on to a conclusion for this video. So that was my beginner's guide to starting bolt action, and I hope that you found it useful. It's just a few tips that I find that are quite useful to kind of keep in mind when building your bolt action force. Now the next video in this series is going to be looking at modelling your British infantry. So obviously I've got my list now, I can move on to actually start assembling the units. So be sure to stay tuned for that. This will be a weekly thing, so be sure to tune in at the same time next week. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.